Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Syifa from 4BD class. This time I will presentate about my journal by title Negotiating Autobiographical Truth Embodying Sensation in the Narrative Screenplay. This article will do several things, central among which is interrogate notions of autobiographical truth that are revealed by writing that, in some capacity, forms the practice of screenwriting. A central question the article thus poses is whether screenwriting necessarily or inevitably falls short of depicting final truth through its literary representations of female experience of physical sensation, or if it depicts some other quality of autobiographical truthfulness. The symmetry of their shared initials is pleasing, whilst their very different approaches to writing provide a broad enough perspective and autobiographical screenwriting that presages and predetermines filmmaking. Through an integration of autobiographical writing, at first Maya Deren and then Margaret Duras, I will show that each has instigated screenwriting intended for and mediated by the filmmaking process, indicating some of the ideas that lie within the text, but which also lie metaphorically beyond the screen surface. The ambiguous nature of the film relationship to truth, be it fiction or documentary, is well recognized and merely condenses the essence of the screenwriting on which it is based. In the screenwriting of Deren and Duras, we are overt examples of their attempts to present utopian discourses and in the form of some sort of autobiographical written progenitor. By focusing an analytical lens on how sensation and the sense are embodied in their work, I contend that we might begin to arrive at deeper truths about how linguistic codification serves to obscure or reveal some level of personal truth in their screenwriting and film work. Perhaps somewhat perversely, I begin the first analysis by looking at a film that was apparently made without a script of a recognizable sort. Message of the Afternoon is a collaboration between Maya Deren and her first husband, Alexander Hammett, and filmed in their home in Los Angeles. It is believed that Hammett was in charge of the camera work and the cinematography, while Deren worked on constructing the narrative and diegesis of the story. In the later version of 1952, non-diegetic music was added by Teiji Ito, Maya's third husband. For this article, however, I concentrate my attention on the original, silent version of the film. There was no script. Seeing the figure of death disappear, Deren transformed into an inanimate object like a statue. This initiates a further transformation of the flower into the knife, concretizing Darren's anxiety about her husband's intentions. This reading of measure signals Darren and Hamid early break with conventional cinematic narrative to forge a profoundly experimental, yet coherently expressive, film form that Darren would not replicate in her later work. In a return to a form of reality, Hamid turns the key in its lock, re-enters the house, and we realize with him what Darren has done to liberate herself. In the narrative of Meshes, which is expressive of a cyclical flow of imagery but also features irrational juxtapositions of objects, images representing tactility and sensuality are tied up with the audience's desires and need for information about the identity of the film's protagonist. The woman could be anyone, but she happens to be Maya Deren, the person responsible for constructing the narrative we are witnessing. As Vivian Schopheck puts it, in our striving to understand Darren's predicament, objectivity and subjectivity lose their presumed clarity, wherein we as the film spectators engage in a carnal interest and investment in being both here and there. in being able both to sense and to be sensible, to be both the subject and the object of desire. With no pre-filmic script by which to assess Munch's adherence to some form of veracity in its representations, it seemed inevitable that we should engage in a certain amount of post-rationalization of what Darren intends us to understand. Darren, in particular, uses the possibility of four works of art to embody extended meanings, raising the possibility of not one, but several meanings to be held by several people, and subsequently contained within a single film. Following this logic, assessment of Measures' autobiographical potential as a meaningful text reveals its power to represent the sense of touch, first through the empathic moving image, and secondly through whatever supplementary writing Darren is able to provide. Whilst Marx cautions us that the haptic image forces the viewer to contemplate the image itself instead of being pulled into narrative. In the absence of traditional screenwriting, Meshes is a silent text, a filmic text that Darren Post rationalizes only in her later writing. What narrative there exists in Meshes is a film account of some aspects of Darren's personal tactics and psychological experience of assorted objects. The tactility we see and perceive in image of Darren's body, a flower, flesh, and glass is of pivotal importance in Meshes. Without conflating the narrative exegesis with our own life experience, we nonetheless cannot help but empathize with Darren's experience of events played out on screen. What related writing by Darren that does exist is distinctly limited, imposing an additional mediating influence through language and making our comprehension of the film obtuse narrative all the more difficult. The writing of Darren in relation to Meshes resists simplistic interpretation, coming as it does after filmmaking was completed. Instead, the narrative in Meshes offers a level of opacity resistant to a singular meaning creation. If, as is commonly accepted, original screenwriting for Meshes of the Afternoon cannot be identified, we must look to Darren's other writing for clues to her preparatory work for the films that credit her as a writer. Whilst avoiding overt ethnographic elements, the film's subject and setting link in directly to Darren's earlier life in Haiti. In a highly rogue piece of writing, the synopsis to Dora's script for Alain Resnais's film Hiroshima Mon Amour furnishes the director with, amongst other supplementary guidance, a synopsis of the salient events that make up the plot of the film. The staccato, abrupt use of single-word sentences only increases the darkness, almost violent descriptions of their physical appearance. In this passage, Duras establishes a direct connection with both the screenwriting for Hiroshima Mon Amour and the mise-en-scene of a similar scene in her novel The North China Lover, which, as Heaven argues, may or may not depict the real events of a transnational affair. As Duras writes, deny the obvious necessity for memory. Against such admissions and claims, we see the inherent problematic of autobiographical writing and its subsequent translation into dramatic screenwriting. In such exchanges, Duras' characters confess to memories of sensations that appear more visceral and immediately physical. In this passage, from the published screenplay in book form, Duras invokes the sense to establish equivalence between the Japanese man and her German lover. In this admission, Duras lays bare her autobiographical connection with Riva, her reconstituted experience of first love and the physical sensation conjured up by its memory. In her screenwriting for Une aussi longue absence, Duras writes as she would a novel. Most notably, in the pursuit scenes, the absence of dialogue urged a particular writing style, with long descriptive passage of the physical movement through spaces and locations of each character only intermittently punctuated by dialogic elements. In her description in the tram's physical appearance as she circles around him, following his actions and seeking confirmation of his true identity, Duras homes in on his physical details. This article situates Darren and Duras in a primarily perfumist pregastary milieu. Their stories are therefore shaped by their contemporary circumstances, circumscribing the expected place of women in the world of literature, screenwriting, and cinematic arts. In their creative outputs that evidence individual visions of autobiographical works, Darren and Duras fall into a somewhat rarefied category of women artists who bring their vision of female experience and the female body to the page and screen. Pre-feminist they may be, yet in their different ways and to greater or lesser degrees, the resulting film depicts female lives and experiences in a manner that is also female gaze. Duras openly presents a narrative that centers on a sexualized young woman, a life narrative that is circumscribed, selected, and which recognizes its appeal to the male gaze. What of written fiction's suitability for expressing aspects of lived experience that can go on to form screenwriting that shapes cinema's self-reflexive representation of lived experience? As evidenced in the various writings of Darren and Duras and in the films their writing instigates, the phenomenology of real events demands the incorporation of fictional narratives for truthfulness to emerge.